Who was the most despicable defendant you've ever seen in court? Defended an old guy, kind of driver who hit and killed a mentally challenged girl who had run across 6 lanes of traffic against the signal. The guy did nothing wrong. The worst part about the situation was that we were being paid by the dead girl's family insurance company, who the family was suing for benefits. I defended a guy who sent number 2 through the mail to his ex-girlfriend from state prison. I don't know how it got past prison officials, but it did, and he didn't deny sending it. However, we went to trial because he wanted me to argue that the number 2 was expressive speech and thus protected by the First Amendment. We lost. In short, crap case, we lost. I had a brilliant gentleman on probation for narcotics trafficking, and he was not permitted to own or use a cell phone. He went in for a substance test with his probation officer, and his cell phone rang in his pocket. The PO went to take the phone from his pocket and also pulled out a large baggie of white snow that he bought to his substance test. So in my state, if you're in a relationship with someone or had been and you commit certain crimes, they get tagged as domestic violence. This tag gives additional penalties. Long story short, my client received a down-under kiss from a girl and then hit her. We went to trial because the state wanted to say that one beige was a relationship and my guy didn't want to do the domestic violence classes. So we took it to the jury, who ruled that one such act isn't a relationship. I've always wondered how many beiges is a relationship. Prior public defender here. Cases involving crimes against kids are the worst. That aside, I once defended a very nice 80-ish-year-old man who'd been married for like 50 years, several kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. He'd been charged with indecent behavior with a horse. Turns out, most of the community knew he'd been intimate with livestock for many years, and they'd usually look the other way. But I guess he went too far with the horse. He pled guilty to the felony, but of course got no jail time. It's quite funny that it was acceptable until this man was caught quite literally horsing around, if you'll pardon the pun. I wonder if he had restrained his behavior to simple horseplay, it would have been more acceptable. Although the offense itself wasn't particularly repugnant, I once had to defend someone who had been charged for driving with a suspended license because he was, quite honestly, in his and my opinion, on his way to an AA meeting to prevent himself from drinking. He was a very serious alcoholic who had been convicted of impaired driving several times, and he had found that the only way he could stay sober was by attending AA meetings regularly. On this particular day, his license was suspended because of a prior conviction. He lived quite a distance outside of town, and his friend, who typically drove him into town, cancelled at the last minute. In a panic, worried that without attending the meeting he'd relapse and inevitably end up hurting someone else, quite possibly by driving impaired again, he drove his own vehicle, stone-cold sober, into town. On the way, he was stopped by the police and charged with driving with a suspended license. In court, I wasn't sure whether to tell the judge that despite the delay on the roadside and the laying of a very serious additional criminal charge to this poor guy's history, he managed to call his AA sponsor, who picked him up on the side of the highway and drove him to the meeting just in time to arrive only a few minutes late and stay sober for an additional 24 hours. Albeit with a reduced likelihood of the same positive outcome on the sobriety front the following day. My worst had to be the, quote, gentleman who spent years using his position to commit the unspeakable act. He videotaped it, so we had to watch at trial. We knew the reason he insisted on going to trial was because he wanted to see the video again. A buddy of mine is a defense attorney who takes a lot of murder cases. He said on a few occasions his defendants became visibly excited when the crime scene photos were shown in court. Just, ugh. Immigration law often intersects with criminal defense law, since having criminal convictions will get you banned or kicked out from many countries. In my first year of practicing, I had to argue for a man convicted of a laundry list of awful offenses against his daughters to be allowed into my country, in order to help care for his disabled young step-granddaughter. Reading the details of what he did to his daughters was horrifying. The now adult daughters wrote letters saying they'd forgiven him and had no problems trusting him around their own kids. I just couldn't stop thinking that this guy was possibly going to be left alone with a little girl who couldn't move or talk, let alone defend herself from a serial convict of some of the worst crimes you can do. Another weird one was a guy who had a felony conviction for threatening and planning to kill his previous attorney. He needed to clear up this issue because of a job opportunity in my country. He sent me this bizarre manifesto about the government conspiracies to poison people via tap water and how it was all the fault of the homosexual girly men in powerful positions. I was scared I'd be his next target, because he'd clearly had severe untreated mental issues, and all it would take was one lazy or sloppy border officer to let him slip through. No details because of confidentiality. I had to work on a file doing research. The specific issues were whether it was possible to have accidental penetration, basically whether the wrong hole is ever a real thing, and if so, if it could result in tearing the butt and hoo-ha together to make one big unhappy hole. Short answers: apparently yes. Risk factors include inexperience in the bedroom, inebriation, and the dark. And as to the second, yes as well. Apparently there are very rare cases of consensual, regular adult fun times doing the same thing. So, I hope that image doesn't hit you at an inopportune moment. Oh, I had a guy stand out of a sunroof and point an AR at an undercover cop. The guy was on probation when this happened. Coworker presented a guy that beat and burned a kitten and recorded it. She had to watch the video and she came to my office crying afterwards. Screw that guy. Not worse, in so much as it was serious, but worse as in, God, do I really have to do this case? One time I was trying to defend a guy that was alleged to have thrown his own wee-wee in a woman's face. The kicker? The guy was an inmate and the woman was a guard at the prison, so it really takes things up a notch penalty-wise. Our defense? Her face tested positive for urea, a substance that is technically in human urine, but is also in an enormous variety of female beauty products. We basically had to argue that she put pee in her own face through one of these products, and they couldn't prove the defendant didn't just throw water on her. I mean, I feel bad for that guard. I wouldn't want someone to throw that stuff in my face. Criminal defense attorney here. I hate doing any adult video or picture cases involving prohibited subject matter. Not only is the crime usually completely reprehensible, but then I have to go and review the discovery myself, which I absolutely hate. Thankfully, haven't had one of those cases in a while. I also hate civil asset forfeiture, but for an entirely different reason. When I get a substance case where the client's assets are seized, not only do I have to deal with the criminal's charges, but I'll also handle the civil asset forfeiture because that's what my firm does. I hate civil laws, but it's quasi-criminal, so I can deal with it. But the whole asset forfeiture scheme is bullcrap. In my jurisdiction, if over 25k is seized, no criminal conviction is necessary for the DA to keep the money, which is entirely backwards. We'll still have the civil trial, but it's by a lesser standard than a criminal trial, as in proved beyond a reasonable doubt versus clear and convincing evidence. There was a movement to reform the asset forfeiture laws, but the DA's association opposed it and effectively killed the reform. Their reasoning being that the DA offices and police departments allocate and rely on asset forfeiture for a part of their budgets, which is essentially admitting that they have a cash incentive to rob people. Ugh, that's some bullcrap that I think is pretty common, sadly. In my country of origin, there was an investigation into police responding instantaneously into speed camera cases as opposed to more important, pressing time-sensitive matters because they were told it would affect their budget. Complete crap. Lawyer who did criminal work experience whilst training. I was part of the legal team that defended a man who killed his partner in their living room. We argued diminished responsibility, as in he was only guilty of manslaughter and not murder, as at the time of the attack he lacked the relevant mental capacity. Jury found against him and he was sent down for 25 years. Last thing he said to me was that he hopes he gets to go into solitary with his guitar and that he'd be better than Eric Clapton by the time he got out. This is a UK case, and the client had been in and out of prison all his life, so I assumed that he would know if he was allowed his guitar while inside. I took his word for it, at least. The jury didn't believe that his previous and ongoing psychological problems, well evidenced by expert witnesses, had an effect on his mental state to such an extent that he lacked the mental capacity to commit murder. They believed that he'd committed the act because he wanted to either kill or cause serious physical harm to his partner at the time. This is the men's REA for murder in the UK. No, I don't feel bad about assisting in his case. He was innocent until proven guilty, and in the UK we have equality of arms in criminal cases, which means his team has the same resources as the prosecutions. I said on a case like this once, manslaughter and time served for essentially the same crime, only the victim died in the hospital days later. The defense was able to successfully argue that her poor health contributed more to the death than the beating did. Probably the hardest part was watching the victim's family react to the verdict. I worked a brief stint at the public defender's office during law school. While I took care of a lot of bail hearings and other simpler things. If you spend any time working for the PD, you'll quickly learn the names of the repeat offenders who come in on a monthly, if not weekly, basis. One such fellow, let's call him Stan, liked to do substances. I was informed by the DA's office that he had a warrant out for a probation violation, so I gave Stan a call and told him to turn himself in. Now, as I said, Stan was a regular and knew all of the drills. If you turn yourself in or get picked up after a certain time, you wear your street clothes in front of the judge instead of the jumpsuit. As it turns out, he turned himself in with a smack pipe in his pocket. This can't get any worse, right? Wrong. I'm thinking that Stan has to be the dumbest man to face that courtroom when I looked up and see him being escorted into the courtroom by the bailiff while wearing a shirt that says, "High as F." Let's just say his bail hearing was about as successful as the rest of his life choices. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Public defender here. This is a matter of public record and I still owe a duty of confidentiality. A client of our office was convicted of attacking someone, defined as a non-consensual physical contact, with motives to the unspeakable act. The alleged victim being a very young relative of the defendant, making it also a crime of domestic. It's by far the darkest case I've been assigned. I can say without reservation that he got a fair shake. I had to defend a guy who was caught in a public park after dark, spanking the mule, with used, dirty baby diapers. The police rolled up on him doing it and shined their spotlight on him, and he looked at them and said, "I have problems." Also defended a guy that walked up to a rival gang member and shot him in the face. Then he and his buddies fled and got involved in a high-speed chase, and he was shooting out of the window at the chasing cops. I had to interview him alone at the downtown Modesto County Jail, which is a total crap hole. It was the first murderer I defended, and I was scared. He turned out to be very polite to me, though. Worst I had was when my client was charged with impersonating a police officer. It was the worst because it was so ridiculous. He was 70 years old and was going to the Social Security office. When he went through the metal detector, he had a police shield that he put in the tray with his keys and phone. He collected police memorabilia and liked to carry it around. The guard at the metal detector arrested him. Oh, that's really sad. I hope this got thrown out and that the old guy didn't get put through too much trouble. Unfortunately, there isn't much detail in the replies to the story. Murder. Started out as a gang initiation carjacking, turned to murder when the juvenile initiate panicked. Juvenile self-deleted at the juvie. Client was torn up as well and wanted to plead guilty. Did a psych evaluation and did a full pre-trial motions practice that lasted a year before we scheduled the plea. He wrote a very heartfelt apology to the girl's dad and I gave it to him after the plea. Still filed habeas against me 2 years later, but that was sort of expected. Another one was doing the worst sort of crimes I've ever tried against his own family. After a vague outcry, police came to the house and recovered evidence from the family's bedrooms in the trash can. Almost got that evidence suppressed because the search was without a warrant, but with permission from his wife. He had previously refused consent, but was led away to the station for questioning. Stories differ as to whether he did it voluntarily or was coerced or even just flat out arrested. And they re-asked for consent from the wife with no husband to contradict her. This one went almost a year as well with a metric ton of motions. In the end, what the police got from the search corroborated the witness testimony to the T, and he eventually decided to plea. But the one that affected me the most was a little kid who literally grew into a man while locked up for 2 cases. 2 cases of aggravated attacks and another case of armed robbery. He stayed in jail almost 3 years while the cases worked themselves out. In the aggravated attack case, he was alleged to have shot 2 lifelong gangbangers due to some dispute. He was a skinny kid, maybe 150 pounds, soaking wet. And these gangbangers were all over 6 foot and heavily built, and a long rap sheet each. Cross-examination on their records went fricking textbook. They each had about 5 convictions, and I asked about the first 3 and then let them hang themselves by saying how they're different now, and how that's all old news, and they don't do that no more. Right. And then you hit them with the subsequent convictions. You wouldn't think that would work, that they'd know their own record and they wouldn't fall for this trick, but they do. Every single time. Not guilty, but still locked up because of the armed robbery. Armed robbery went to trial and we had an expert on eyewitness testimony, Professor Brigham. He was a professor at FSU along with Elizabeth Loftus, the preeminent expert in the field of human memory and eyewitness testimony. He dazzled the jury. Truthfully, I can't take credit for any of this. Not guilty again. A few days later, he came to see me at my office. I still remembered a skinny little kid. Not anymore. In street clothes, this guy was built. Somehow I missed all of that, either looking through the partition glass at the jail or being preoccupied with the other stuff in court. We always had a good rapport, so we spent a good hour talking about future plans. That'd be the last time I'd see him, however. A year or so later, he got arrested for murder and is now serving a life sentence. I think that if he had been convicted of some of the other charges, maybe he wouldn't have that murder. Maybe if he'd been away for 5 or 10 years, he could have come out more mature. Not as a 20-year-old jacked-up kid who's been deprived of fun things for the past 3 years. I deliberately kept myself ignorant of the specifics of the murder. Maybe he killed another useless gangbanging psychopath. Maybe he killed a nun. I think it's better not knowing. Worked on a case in which the defendant was accused of decapitating his grandma with a bread knife. Gruesome and scary. Well, really violent cases of the unspeakable act, and by that I mean when the victim was beaten, among other things. They're never easy, particularly because the perpetrators tend to be extreme narcissists who are very angry at women because reasons. Elliot Rodger, the 2014 Santa Barbara killer, is a good example of that type and was much more articulate than most. The narcissism makes defending them a real chore because they tend to be delusional. The victim will never testify. Less creepily, and setting aside sovereign citizens and their ilk, I had a fellow who was dealing smack in a local bar when the cops did a closing check and recognized him as someone whose parole conditions prohibited him from being in bars. He brightly fled to the men's room, a dead end, to flush his dope, but they were right on his heels, so they had him. This frustrated him so badly that he pooped his pants and tried to fling the resulting product at the officers. He was never really clear on why I didn't think this was a triable case. I had a client who was a narco in Colombia extradited to the US. Killed more people than he could count. Actually, lost track. A guy who killed another person in a road rage incident and shot his dog. Strafed bullets across the windshield to scare the guy's wife and then went home and went to bed. I could go on for days. A friend of mine's dad is a defense attorney. He once had a client who strangled a working girl to death because she laughed at him because he couldn't get hard after shooting smack directly into his eggplant. Her dad's half-assed defense was, well, Your Honor, in his defense, he was really high from the smack, so he clearly wasn't thinking. The guy was quickly sentenced to many years in prison. I mean, what else can you say in a case like that? I don't know how anyone can even do a half-assed job of something like that, let alone put any proper effort into defending a guy with so many problematic things going on at once. Takes a different sort of person to work as a public defender, I guess. The 90-year-old woman who routinely smuggled substances in her hoo-ha into prisons was more interesting than most. The gang murderers are pretty routine at this point. As a young lady, it's the ones who aren't killing in the name of territory, street cred, among other things that get to me. I was really affected by a particularly brutal, cold, calculated, sick 30-something man accused of murder. He was eerily calm and cocky about his encounter with an underage girl he met and chatted up for about 20 minutes that resulted ultimately in her drowning with suspicious surrounding circumstances. He was obviously disturbed and it was very unsettling just being near him. Images of him smiling for the news cameras in the courtroom will weirdly pop into my head on a somewhat random basis, and it still gives me the heebie-jeebies. The act he put on when he insisted on being put on the stand in a trial ruined him. He would have walked but for his ridiculous testimony. Within seconds, the jury, who had been paying close attention previously, looked horrified as he told these stories and stopped taking notes. Their minds were made up as soon as he opened his creepy mouth. He was quickly convicted. We did a really stellar job in his case, but he dug his own grave. Justice was served. Copyright defense attorney here. Lots of people have been put through the ringer over BitTorrent downloads in the last few years. My favorite story is not from my client, but from the same case. During one of the first civil BitTorrent file-sharing cases, it became clear to me, and the plaintiff, that one defendant was lying. The guy had erased his hard drive to destroy evidence after receiving the discovery request for the computer. He then reinstalled Windows and named the drive Squeaky. He put it into an encrypting USB enclosure and handed it over. It took them a while, but they figured it out. The guy got hit with a $250,000 judgment for 5 downloads. So the guy was fined $250,000 for downloading 5 items? Like 5 movies or something? That's not justice. You ruin someone's life for downloading a movie. That's totally unbalanced. Okay, I'll pop in. Years ago, there was a silent alarm that went off at the petting part of the zoo at about 3 a.m. Usually nothing, so the cops don't show up lights flashing and guns blazing, so they're walking around taking a look and find a guy on a stool just going at it with a cow. Now, this is one of the most unfortunate looking human beings you can imagine. Dude is hideous, and honestly, you kind of feel sorry for him and understand that the petting zoo is a logical place, in his mind, to find partners. Cops arrest him and put him in holding. Because of the timing of it all, it was just before a shift change, so every cop working in the precinct has to come by and laugh at the cow puffer. Then they tell the story to all the guys coming on shift, so they all go by and do the same thing. We got an initial hearing that morning, it was a big city. When I tell the judge that story, he throws out the case and tells the guy that he's been punished enough by the embarrassment. A friend of the family is a lawyer who has a favorite story that he likes to tell. Basically, he had to defend someone who just randomly punched a stranger, a 90-year-old grandmother, in the face one day, in front of a dozen witnesses, evidently just because he was in a bad mood. The only defense he could come up to give before the judge was, "Your Honor, he only hit her once." When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.